On the night of March 31st, 1922, 6 people are murdered on the Hinterkaifeck farmstead in Germany. The case has never been solved, and it has been of great interest in Germany ever since. This is the case of the Hinterkaifeck murders. Now, before I get started with today's case, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. First off, I am sorry that this video is going to be going up on a Tuesday instead of a Monday. Things have been crazy. I have new equipment, which you might be able to tell of the difference of quality in both the lighting and the audio, so I hope you guys can tell because this was an amazing Christmas gift from my grandparents to help me with my filming, so thank you so much to my grandma and grandpa, and I know that my grandma's going to watch this at some point, so I love you guys and thank you so much. Carrying on though, a lot of the information for today's case is originally in German. I had to do a lot of using Google Translate to translate an entire website essentially, and I had to do a lot of sorting through all of that information and double checking and making sure that translation was coming out right as far as I could tell, so hopefully the information is correct. If you guys do speak German and you have the time to go through any of the information from the websites in the pinned comment at the top of the comments down below, that's where I always put my sources for every video. Please let me know if I got something wrong. I absolutely don't mind that. I love when you guys correct me to make sure that my videos are of the best content quality for you guys. I think that that's really great. So don't be afraid to correct me if you do speak German and you see that I have translated something wrong. Thank you ahead of time for providing me with better information. Moving on from that, I have decided that every other Monday, as you guys know, I do true crime book reviews. My original plan had been to do research with me videos every other Monday that wasn't a book review, but instead of doing that, I'm going to be doing either historical mysteries or like really, really old unsolved cases. So this could be anything from before the 1960s. So I hope you guys are going to enjoy that. I did just graduate with my bachelor's in history, so I kind of feel like this is an interesting addition to bring to the channel and something that I find really cool because we can talk about things that aren't always quite as, I guess, you know, depressing and, what's the word? Dark? I don't know. There's better words, but I can't think of them right now. But yeah, so I thought that this would be something cool to bring to you guys. I hope that you enjoy it. Please let me know what you guys think of this idea in the comments down below. I love to hear from you all. And I just wanted to let you know one more thing. I'm going to be taking next Monday off. I will be posting next Wednesday and Friday, but as you know, next Monday is Christmas, so I'm not going to be posting on that day because I'm going to be super busy with my 2-year-old because she's got presents to open and stuff to play with. So now that we've got all of that out of the way, let us move on to the Hinterkaifeck murders. Now, Hinterkaifeck is a farmstead in Germany. There were 6 people living in the house at the time of the murders. There was the basically the patriarch, which was Andreas Gruber. There was his wife, Kazelia Gruber, their daughter, Victoria Gabrielle, their daughter's children, which was Kazelia Gabrielle, named after Victoria's mother, and also Joseph Gabrielle. In addition to this, there was a maid living on the property, and her name is Maria Baumgartner. So let's go ahead and kind of jump into some of the background information, and we are just going to work our way through this case because it's very interesting. This is a case that has stuck with me since the moment I first heard about it because it is honestly terrifying to think about, and I feel that you guys might understand as I get further into the case here. So, in 1877, Kazelia married her first husband, which was Josef Assam, and he had actually inherited Hinterkaifeck farmstead from his own father. Now, in 1885, Joseph died, and it was a year later that Kazelia had actually remarried, and because the death of her first husband had basically given her co-ownership of the farmstead, her and her husband Andreas, they stayed on the farmstead and they owned it together. Now, in 1914, their daughter Victoria married a man by the name of Karl Gabriel. It was in December of 1914. It was on December 12th, actually, that he actually died in the trenches of World War I. He was stationed in France at the time, and it was just very unfortunate. They hadn't been married long, and now Victoria was a widow, and she was also pregnant at the time. It was in January of 1915, just a month after her husband's death, that she gave birth to their daughter, who she named after her mother, Kazelia. Now, in May of 1915, Andreas was sentenced to a year in jail, and Victoria was sentenced to a month in jail due to an incestuous relationship. There had been rumors for a very long time that the family didn't really do a whole lot to exactly squash that. Basically, they were just in an incestuous relationship, and there was a lot of question about, essentially, about the father of Victoria's two children. Now, at this point in time, her son hadn't been born yet. That would happen a little later, but throughout the years, there's been a lot of question, even still into today, whether or not Andreas was the father of one or both of her children at all. And it could have a lot to do with possible motive if he's not the father and another person is. But we are going to jump back into that later. So, to kind of go along with these rumors, there was evidence given by, or well, not really evidence, but more so testimony given by their maid at that time, which was Crescence Reiger. And she said that she had actually walked into the barn one night and had witnessed Andreas and Victoria having intercourse with each other. She had also kind of walked in and overheard multiple different conversations on multiple different days, revolving around the same type of, thing about them basically being in a sexual relationship with each other. So it was in 1999 that their neighbor, Lawrence Schlittenbauer, actually inherited the neighboring farm from his parents. Now, this farm was approximately 500 meters from Hinterkaifeck. So it was also in 1903 that apparently, according to Lorenz, Victoria had admitted to his wife that she was being sexually abused by her father. And I should mention real quick at this point that the conviction of Andreas and Victoria for an incestuous relationship before that had been for the periods between 1907 and 1910. So this admission was definitely well before the term in which they were convicted for having an incestuous relationship. So it's really unknown, if this was absolutely happening, when exactly this started, and how long it lasted. Now, it was in 1918 that Lawrence's wife died, and between the months of August and December that very same year, Lawrence and Victoria had an intimate relationship with each other. According to Lawrence, they actually had sex 5 times during those months there at the end of 1918. And it was in 1919 that Victoria gave birth to her son, Joseph. I believe I'm saying that right. It might possibly be Josef. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm going to continue saying Joseph. So I'm sorry if that is not quite correct. Now, there was a lot of speculation at this time as to whether or not Lorenz was actually the father of Joseph. It was hotly debated. There were a lot of rumors that it was actually Andreas that was the father of Joseph, and there were periods of time where Lorenz himself actually kind of spread these rumors as well, even though he also claims that at one point he had accepted that he was Joseph's father and that he even wanted to marry Victoria, but that Andreas absolutely refused to allow that to happen. But it's just a very confusing detail, and nobody's actually really sure who the father of Joseph was. Now, it was in August of 1921 that the maid, who had been there for many years at this point, Crescence Reiger, decided to leave. At this point, I believe she had a 1-year-old child of her own, and I do know that some people have reported that she claimed that there were footsteps in the attic and that she believed the place to be haunted. From my research, it wasn't exactly clear that she ever made those statements, so I just wanted to let you guys know that some people do include that in their coverage of this case, but I wasn't able to actually come across anything, I guess, more concrete that suggested that she had actually made those statements at any point. Now, it was March 30th of 1922 when Andreas Gruber had gone outside to, essentially work on the farmstead, and he discovered that there was a lock on a shed on the property that had been broken. It seemed that somebody had attempted to, take things. It was an attempted burglary or something of the sort, and somebody had definitely been in the shed and had gone through things. Andreas also noted that the surrounding forest, there were footsteps actually coming out from the forest and going onto the Hinterkaifeck property, but there were no footsteps leading away from the property at all, which was definitely suspicious. He supposedly admitted this to Lorenz as well as an ironmonger in the nearby village. So there were a couple of people that he told about this. He also mentioned that he found a newspaper on the property, which was interesting because it was not a newspaper that they would have owned. It was very recent and it was not something that they had purchased, so they had no idea why that newspaper would have been on their property to begin with. And in addition to this, it's rumored that he had mentioned to people that he had actually was unable to find the keys for their home on that day. Now, it was actually this very same night, March 30th of 1922, that apparently either Kazelia, the grandma, or her daughter Victoria, one of the two had supposedly run off in the middle of the night. And when the daughter Kazelia had gone to school the next day, she was very tired. A teacher asked her about it, and she said that and it's just, this is where it's not clear as to whether or not it was Kazelia or Victoria who had run away in the night, but she said that one of them had essentially run off in the middle of the night and they had to spend the entire night looking for her. And this is actually apparently when Andreas had come across the newspaper on their property. Now, on the day of March 31st, 1922, Andreas had mentioned to some people again that strange things were happening on the farm. He mentioned that he had been hearing footsteps in the attic at night, but that he wasn't able to find where the footsteps were actually coming from. He couldn't find a source of the footsteps themselves. He also mentioned that the previous night that there had been a cattle who had been untied and that he had had to go out into the yard in order to, kind of rein the cattle back in and get them all tied up again, which was interesting and some people think could have been related to possibly, a run through of how to lure people outside to commit the murder. It was also on the day of March 31st that the new maid arrived, Maria Baumgartner. This was her first night in the home, and unfortunately it was that night that everyone on the Hinterkaifeck property would be murdered. So it was this night that in the barn, 4 members of the family had been possibly lured out there and murdered one by one. It is possibly believed that the order of these killings was first Victoria, followed by her mother, and then her father, and then her daughter Kazelia. After these members of the family had been murdered, the killer went inside the home. At this point, he murdered Joseph, and then he murdered the maid who had literally just arrived there only hours before. Over the next few days, Kazelia misses school and the family misses church. It is on April 4th that a repairman shows up to the home. There is something that needed to be fixed. He tried to get the attention of Andreas or Kazelia from the front door of the home. He was unable to get anybody to come to the door. However, he did hear a dog barking from inside the home, which is important, so keep that in mind here. Now, at this point, he goes to the back door and he tries to get the attention of somebody at the back door. He does note that the door was in fact locked, and at this point he still is unable to get anyone's attention. He essentially hangs around for a little while. He continues to try to get people's attention and is still unable to. So at this point he ends up just going into the yard where the thing is that he needs to fix. He fixes it and he turns to leave. At this point he first notices that the barn door is wide open, which he hadn't noticed previously. But the really odd thing that he notices is that as he's walking back by the house, there is a dog now tied up outside the back door, and he goes to check the back door, but the back door is still locked, which means that between the time he arrived and between the time that he was leaving, a dog had first been inside the house barking and was now tied up outside the back door, which had been locked when he checked the first time and when he checked upon seeing the dog outside. The repairman left and he let some people know that he was unable to get anyone's attention while he was on the property. At this point, a few different people had actually stopped by for different reasons and nobody had been able to get anyone to come to the door, but there was evidence that somebody had been on the property. So there was a lot of strange things going on. They decided to investigate. So Lorenz and a couple of other neighbors, they got together and they came over to the Hinterkaifeck property property to investigate what was going on. And it was at this point that they entered the barn and they found the 4 bodies in the barn. Now, at this point, Lorenz was distressed. He unstacked the bodies and he claimed that he was doing this because he was looking for his son, Joseph. He wasn't able to find the baby there, so then they went inside the home, and at this point, they noticed that Joseph and Maria, the maid, had both been murdered as well. The police were then informed. It took them a while to get there. Somebody stayed in the kitchen, but a lot of things had been disturbed on the property. Multiple people had been there trying to get their attention. They had been on the property itself, which kind of muddies possible evidence that may have been maybe left on the ground, or evidence of somebody walking in and then walking out, anything like that they could have found. There's a lot of chance that, none of that would have even been usable because there had been so many people there at that point. In addition to this, Lorenz had actually touched and disturbed the bodies in the barn, and multiple people had been in the barn, multiple people had been in the house. There were reports that some of these people were even eating food out of the kitchen while they were waiting for police to arrive. It was honestly just a huge, hot mess. According to some reports, police found human feces and crumbs of food in the attic of the Hinterkaifeck property. This was believed to be evidence that the murderer had spent several days in the home prior to killing the family. According to a lot of the people who had tried to essentially call upon the Hinterkaifeck home during the days between the murder and the discovery of the bodies, there was evidence that somebody had actually been living in the home during this time when the family was all dead. There had been smoke coming out of the chimney, and this was reported by neighbors. There had been food that had been eaten in the kitchen since the murders had occurred. There was also the fact that the animals on the farmstead appeared to have been fed and taken care of during those few days when the family was dead. There is also the fact that somebody had to have been on the property while the repairman was there, because the dog had previously been inside the house barking, and when the repairman was done and walked back around the house, the dog was tied up outside the back door, which was still locked. So there is plenty of evidence to suggest that not only had somebody probably been in the home before the murders, but they had stayed in the home afterwards as well. Now, robbery had been ruled out as the motivation for this crime because police were easily able to come across a large amount of money inside the home. The Hinterkaifeck family, they were pretty decently well off for the area. Now, it was on April 6th and 7th that the autopsies were done, and it was on April 8th that the family was buried. Now, the funeral drew a lot of people from neighboring communities, and there was a church that had services following the funeral, and they actually were such a small church, they were not able to even allow everyone to come in for these services who had been at the funeral because so many people had showed up. Now, the autopsy reports no longer exist. They were most likely lost in a fire, but essentially all of the people in the family and the maid had all been struck multiple times in the head. Other than Joseph, he was killed with one very strong blow to the head while he laid essentially in his bassinet. That is it's very disturbing to think about. But the rest of the family had been hit multiple times in the head. Some had injuries to their faces and their necks. In addition to this, the jaw had been shattered on the daughter Kazelia, and it was believed that she had actually lived for several hours after the attack because there was evidence that she had pulled out her own hair, which was clutched in her hands when she was found. Now, there was a statement on the website that I primarily used for the research of this case that said that back in this day, when somebody was murdered, it was believed that the victim's head was the best source of evidence on the body. And so apparently it was a common practice for coroners to remove the head from the body, and if the suspect had not yet been apprehended, they didn't know who it was, then the bodies would be buried without their heads, and the heads would be saved in case they needed to look at them again for possible further evidence. So the heads of everyone on the Hinterkaifeck property that had been murdered were removed from their bodies before they were buried, and these heads were sent to Munich. Now, eventually, these skulls were lost during World War II, which is pretty understandable. A lot of things going on, kind of hard to keep track of all of those kinds of things. So unfortunately, the skulls, no one knows where they are today, but the bodies are buried and there is a memorial kind of near the Hinterkaifeck property. Now, eventually, the farmstead was inherited by Andreas's brother, Bernard Gruber, and he didn't really want to, it seems, at first sell the farm, but the Gabriel family, related to Victoria's dead husband, Carl Gabriel, they wanted to purchase the property. There were some conditions that were eventually outlined for this purchase, and they weren't too upset about these conditions because they didn't really want the buildings on the property. They wanted the farmland property. That's what they were hoping to get from buying the property from Andreas's brother. Now, they demolished all of the buildings as part of the conditions for buying the property, and this happened a year after the murders. And just before the demolition happened, literally the day before, an artist was commissioned to do a watercolor of the property, which I will show up here so that you guys can see it. It was during the demolition of these buildings that the murder weapon was actually found. It happened to be a mattock, which is a sort of farm tool. I will have a couple of pictures of examples up here on the video for you now so you guys kind of understand what I'm talking about. This had apparently been concealed somewhere on the property, and it was still bloody when they unearthed it during the demolition. In addition to the mattock, they also found a rusty pocket knife. So now that we've gone through all of that, we should probably get into the theories. Now, two brothers, Anton and Adolf Gump, they were accused by their sister while she lay on her deathbed. She accused them of having committed the murders of the family on Hinterkaifeck. Now, the interesting thing about that is that they were, it seems, actually tried at one point for the murders possibly, but it was determined that there was a 20-year statute of limitations and they were actually not able to be tried for the crime. And eventually it later came out that their sister was actually very untruthful about pretty serious things like this. So it's really hard to tell if there was ever actually any reason to believe that these two people had any real involvement with the case. There's just no evidence of that, and unfortunately a lot of the evidence in this case has been lost over the years, so we just really don't know. Now, some people also believe that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had actually never died in World War I. For some reason, people believe that he possibly did live and that he came back and committed these murders quite randomly. Now, the reason that I kind of discredit this case, I don't feel that there's any merit to it. There were a number of accounts from soldiers that were in the trenches with Carl when he died, that saw him die. There were multiple accounts of this, and it just doesn't really seem to make sense or to hold up very well at all. So while it's an interesting theory, I don't feel that there's any evidence to suggest that it's even possible that he lived or that he had anything to do with the murders. Now, one of the most widely accepted theories is that it was actually the neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer who decided to murder the Hinterkaifeck family. There were definitely reasons that he may have had, ill will towards the family. He was supposedly the father of Victoria's son, Joseph, and there were times when he said that he had accepted that he was the father, he wanted to marry Victoria, but Andreas Gruber refused to let that happen. And then there were times where he was actively spreading the rumors that Andreas was actually Joseph's father. It's all very confusing. So there's not only that, but there's also the fact that Victoria was about to sue Lorenz for money to help support her child, and he wasn't very happy about this because apparently the Grubers were much more well off than most of the people, and while Lorenz was well off for that area, he wasn't as well off as they were. And so there is the possibility that he felt quite a bit of resentment towards Victoria and her family because she was going to still sue him for money, even though, according to a bunch of people, he wasn't actually the father of her son, and, there was no way to really tell. In addition to this, we also have to keep in mind the fact that Lorenz was one of the people that found the bodies, and not only was he part of the group that discovered the bodies, he also disturbed the bodies in the barn. This is definitely interesting for somebody who at times claimed that, Joseph wasn't his son, that he was actually the son of Andreas. It's hard to understand why, if he believed that, he would use the excuse that he was moving the bodies in the barn because he was looking for his son, Joseph. So it's very confusing. I think that there is definitely a lot of intriguing things that lead us to the possibility that it could have been Lorenz. But we also have to keep in mind that this could have been a complete stranger who just randomly decided to terrorize this family, in the days before their murder, and then to actually murder them, and then to stay on their property following the murder. Now, the only other theories that have really any possible merit to them are the idea that it could have been somebody hoping to inherit Hinterkaifeck who actually committed the murders. Now, I don't put a lot of stock into this theory because the person who was next in line to inherit Hinterkaifeck, he was Andreas's brother, and he actually still ended up selling the property to the Gabriel family. Now, some might think that, well, maybe the Gabriel family committed the murder because they wanted the property. When I think about that, I think that there's really so much chance that they never would have even gotten the property in the first place that it doesn't make sense for them to go to the trouble of murdering 6 people so violently in order to gain this farmland property that very well may have never even ended up in their own hands, because there was no possibility that they were, about to inherit it straight from Andreas. So while some people think that there's a little bit of merit to this theory, I personally don't put a lot of stock into it. I feel that if I had to pick a theory, it's hard to do. I would say that the most likely ideas are either that Lorenz did it, or he had, some sort of involvement in it, or he knew who did it, or it was a completely random stranger. So, unfortunately, it seems that this case will never be solved. We will never have answers as to who committed this crime or why they did it. So I hope that you guys enjoyed today's case. This one has stuck with me for a very long time, as I said earlier. It's quite terrifying to think of somebody literally living in your attic for days before murdering you, and then living in your house for days after before people finally show up to discover the bodies. It's something that I find very disturbing. I personally don't like the attic that's literally right above my head right now. It freaks me out because, also, I can't get into the attic. Like, I'm not physically capable of doing that with, the tools that I have. So, attics, they're creepy. They're creepy. And to think that somebody could be hiding up there ready to murder you at any moment is a terrifying thought. So, I hope that you guys enjoyed this older case. Unfortunately, like I said, we're probably never going to have any answers to it, but it's definitely interesting. It makes you think, and I hope that you guys enjoyed. Please remember to stay respectful in the comments down below, as always, and if you guys want to see the sources that I used for this case, there are fewer sources than usual, but that has a lot to do with the fact that this case is honestly just so old, and that a lot of the records were eventually lost in fires. And while I'm thinking of that, I would also like to mention that Lorenz's farmstead, again 500 meters away from Hinterkaifeck, burned down a few years later, and there were a bunch of important documents related to the Hinterkaifeck case that were actually on his property that were lost in that fire, and he was actually able to essentially recoup all of his losses from insurance. So that could also possibly be something that leans towards Lorenz possibly being involved in this case. But of course, we don't know. He was investigated heavily, but there was never any actual evidence to say that he did it. So again, please remember to stay respectful down below, and I will see you guys again very soon for another case. Bye, everyone.